A German Shepherd mother stood over her two puppies inside a crowded Kentucky shelter, but something about her behavior made everyone uneasy. One puppy could cross the orange line on the floor without a problem. The other could not. Every time little Rosie was led toward that hallway, the mother stepped between her and the humans. Some called it aggression. Then Navy SEAL Ethan Walker saw something the others had missed. Why was the mother protecting only one puppy? What was Rosie struggling with that no one had noticed? And with the shelter preparing to separate all three within days, would Ethan understand the warning before a decision was made for them? This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Early autumn had softened Lexington, Kentucky. With cool gray mornings, damp leaves beginning to gather along the sidewalks, and a thin mist that rested over the horse fields beyond the city before burning away by noon. Bluegrass Animal Rescue sat at the edge of an industrial road where delivery trucks passed more often than pedestrians, a low brick building with faded blue doors, narrow outdoor runs, and the permanent mixture of disinfectant, kibble, wet fur, and nervous hope that seemed to belong to every shelter in America. Maggie arrived there on a Tuesday morning with two puppies pressed against her sides. She was a 4-year-old German Shepherd, large-framed but underweight, with a black saddle stretching across her back, warm tan legs, a dark, intelligent face, and amber-brown eyes that watched hands before they watched faces. Her ribs could not quite be seen beneath her coat, but the narrowing of her waist suggested she had missed more than a few proper meals. Her ears stood upright, though the left one sometimes tipped outward when she became tired. Maggie did not bark when the kennel door opened. She simply placed herself between the opening and her puppies. The 3 dogs had been discovered the previous evening in the laundry room of a rental house after the tenants disappeared without warning. The property owner, a heavy-set man in his 60s with work-calloused hands and a habit of speaking too loudly when nervous, had gone inside expecting broken furniture and unpaid bills. Instead, he had found Maggie curled around 2 puppies beside an empty plastic water bowl. He had left a bag of dog food, called animal control, and spent the next hour sitting on the back steps because Maggie would not let him come close enough to touch the puppies. By the time they reached Bluegrass Animal Rescue, nobody knew how long the dogs had been alone. The puppies were 9 weeks old, and already different enough that no one would have mistaken them for interchangeable bundles of black and tan fur. Tucker, the male, was the larger of the two, broad through the chest for his age, with oversized paws, a rich black saddle, tan eyebrows, and ears that had not yet decided whether they wanted to stand or flop. He treated fear as something that happened to other creatures. Within 20 minutes of arriving, Tucker had discovered the treat pouch clipped to a technician's belt and followed it with the concentration of a man following the smell of barbecue. Rosie was smaller, finer-boned, with a narrower muzzle, softer brown eyes, a darker mask around the face, and one ear that leaned slightly farther outward than the other. Rosie watched before moving. When a stainless steel bowl clattered in the kennel beside them, Tucker jumped and immediately ran toward the noise. Rosie, startled a beat later, turned her head sharply to the right and nearly lost her footing. Rachel Morgan noticed. Rachel was 49, tall and lean with freckled fair skin, shoulder-length auburn hair threaded with early gray, and the strong forearms of someone who had spent 20 years lifting frightened animals into carriers. She managed the shelter's behavioral wing with a calm voice and an unfortunate talent for delivering bad news without dressing it in prettier language. Years earlier, Rachel had learned that good intentions could become dangerous when people confused compassion with wishful thinking. She loved animals deeply, but she did not describe every growl as fear or every bite as misunderstanding. Sometimes a dog was frightened. Sometimes a dog was dangerous. Often it was both. That morning, Rachel had another problem waiting on her desk. The shelter's ventilation system had failed inspection. Repairs would require shutting down nearly a third of the kennel wing by the weekend. "Let's do the family assessment first," Rachel said, glancing through Maggie's intake notes. An orange strip of tape had been placed across the floor of the evaluation room, marking the point beyond which technicians changed positions during handling exercises. It was not dramatic. It was just tape, bright enough to notice against gray linoleum. Tucker crossed it first. A young technician lured him with a small piece of chicken. Tucker trotted forward without hesitation, tail high, toenails clicking on the polished floor. Maggie remained lying near the wall. Her eyes followed him, but her body stayed loose. Tucker reached the technician, swallowed the chicken with disgraceful speed, and immediately searched the woman's other hand for evidence of more. "Confident little criminal," Rachel murmured. Then Rosie's turn came. Rosie approached more carefully. Her paws widened slightly as she moved onto the smoother section of floor. The technician shortened the leash and encouraged her forward. Rosie tilted her head toward the right, blinked, and stopped just before the orange line. Maggie's head rose. The technician took another step. Maggie stood. No bark, no snarl, just a sudden stillness so complete that Rachel's smile vanished. "Easy," Rachel said. Rosie was coaxed one step farther. Maggie moved between them. Her shoulders stiffened. The technician stopped. Rachel waited several seconds, then asked her to try once more from a different angle. Rosie reached the line again. Maggie stepped forward again. When the leash tightened and Rosie's front paws slipped slightly, Maggie's lips lifted just enough to show the edges of her teeth. Rachel ended the exercise immediately. On the evaluation sheet, she wrote 2 words in careful block letters: protective aggression. Ethan Walker had watched the entire thing from the open doorway. At 41, Ethan still carried the hard physical outline of an active Navy SEAL. 6'2", broad shoulders tapering to a lean waist, powerful forearms, and the economical posture of a man who rarely wasted motion. His dark brown hair was clipped close in military fashion, with faint gray beginning at the temples. A neatly trimmed beard sharpened an already angular jaw, and a thin pale scar ran just beneath his chin, nearly hidden unless the light caught it. Ethan was in Kentucky temporarily, helping supervise advanced training at a nearby military facility, and he spent occasional off-duty mornings volunteering at Bluegrass because physical work suited him better than ceremonial charity events. Around people, he was polite rather than warm. He listened carefully, spoke briefly, and had the irritating habit of deciding what a situation meant before everyone else finished explaining it. That habit had served him well in environments where hesitation carried consequences. It had also cost him friendships. Years earlier, during a training operation, Ethan had overridden a junior teammate's concern because the data in front of him seemed clearer than the man's instinct. Nobody died, but the exercise ended badly enough that Ethan never forgot the humiliation of realizing competence could become arrogance without changing its face. Even so, old habits did not disappear simply because a man had once been punished by them. "She's controlling the smaller one," Ethan said. Rachel did not look up from the form. "Maybe. She let the male go. I saw. So it isn't separation anxiety. I saw that too." Ethan folded his arms. Maggie was now licking Rosie's ear while Tucker attempted to chew the corner of a rubber mat. "She's deciding where that puppy can move." Rachel finally looked at him. "And you've known her for 11 minutes?" The remark landed exactly where Rachel intended. Ethan said nothing. Human beings liked explanations, because explanations created the feeling of control. A mother guarding one vulnerable child more closely than another fit neatly into a story people already understood: overprotection. It was easy to imagine Maggie as a possessive mother who had survived abandonment by tightening her grip on the weaker puppy. It was even easier for Ethan because he had spent much of his adult life learning to identify patterns before they became problems. Yet dogs did not owe people a simple explanation for their behavior. Sometimes what looked like disobedience was pain. Sometimes what looked like devotion was fear. Sometimes love itself could become unhealthy when fear was allowed to make every decision. Ethan knew that intellectually. Standing in the doorway, however, he still believed Maggie's problem was primarily Maggie. Rachel's radio crackled. A maintenance supervisor confirmed what she had been dreading. Repairs would begin Friday. 12 kennels had to be cleared. She exhaled slowly and looked again at the 3 dogs. Tucker already had an opening with a puppy adoption program across town. Rosie could be placed with a foster volunteer experienced with young dogs. Maggie was more complicated. The phrase Rachel had just written on the form would almost certainly move the mother dog into a behavioral rescue rather than a standard adoption pathway. 3 destinations, 3 separate vehicles, 3 files. Shelter work often turned heartbreaking choices into paperwork because paperwork was how heartbreak became manageable. Rachel hated that truth, but she had lived with it long enough to stop pretending that love created square footage. "We have until Friday for the puppies," she said quietly. "Saturday morning for Maggie." Ethan looked at her. "You're splitting them?" "Unless something changes." "They just got here, and 12 other dogs are already here." Rachel's voice remained steady, but the skin beneath her eyes looked tired. "That's the part people don't put in rescue videos. Sometimes nobody is cruel. Sometimes there are simply more animals than rooms." Ethan left the evaluation area shortly afterward, still thinking Maggie's attachment to Rosie had probably become excessive during whatever weeks they had spent alone. Near the exit, he heard Tucker's nails skittering behind him. The puppy had escaped Rachel's loose hold for half a second and barreled across the evaluation room, straight over the orange tape, chasing a dropped treat. Maggie raised her head. Nothing more. Rachel caught Tucker, laughing despite herself. A minute later, another technician guided Rosie toward the same area while preparing to return the puppy to the kennel. Rosie approached the orange line. Her steps shortened. Maggie rose immediately. The change was instant. She moved in front of Rosie, body angled across the puppy's path, eyes fixed not on the technician's face but on the floor ahead. Ethan stopped with one hand on the outer door. Tucker had crossed. Maggie had allowed it. Rosie approached. Maggie stopped her. If the mother dog simply could not tolerate losing a puppy, she should have stopped both of them. Ethan looked back at the bright orange line cutting across the gray floor, then at Rosie's uncertain feet, then at Maggie standing perfectly still between the puppy and whatever lay beyond. For the first time that morning, Ethan wondered whether Maggie was not the answer to the problem at all. Maybe she was the one trying to tell them where the problem was. By the next morning, the thin mist over Lexington had lifted, leaving a pale autumn sky and damp pavement around Bluegrass Animal Rescue. Ethan Walker returned before most of the volunteers had finished their first coffee. He told himself he had come back because the shelter needed another pair of hands. The explanation sounded reasonable enough until he found himself standing outside Maggie's kennel instead of carrying food bowls like everyone else. Maggie was awake. She lay with her chest raised and her front paws crossed, watching him through the gate. Tucker was busy attacking a frayed rope toy with the confidence of a puppy convinced he had personally discovered combat. Rosie sat beside her mother, head tipped slightly to the right. When Ethan shifted his weight, Rosie looked toward him only after Maggie's ears moved. That delay bothered him more than it had the day before. Rachel Morgan came down the corridor carrying a clipboard and stopped when she saw him. "You came back to prove yourself right," she said. Ethan glanced at her. "Good morning to you, too." Rachel did not smile. She had changed into faded navy scrubs, and her auburn hair was tied at the nape of her neck. Exhaustion made the freckles across her cheeks more visible. "You can observe," she said. "You can help. You do not get to manufacture a reaction because curiosity is bothering you." Ethan disliked being spoken to as though he were reckless. What annoyed him more was that Rachel had guessed exactly what he intended to do. He had spent most of his adult life being rewarded for noticing patterns quickly. In military work, hesitation could turn a manageable problem into a catastrophe. Speed became instinct. Instinct became identity. Friends had occasionally accused him of treating conversation like an operation: assess, decide, act. Ethan had laughed it off. Yet standing outside Maggie's kennel, he recognized the old irritation rising inside him whenever someone asked him to wait after he believed the answer was already visible. Rachel agreed to another controlled assessment only after making the conditions clear. Maggie would remain loose inside the evaluation room. Rosie would wear a lightweight leash. Nobody would restrain Maggie unless necessary, and the exercise would stop at the first clear escalation. Ethan nodded to every condition. Then, once inside, he began bending them almost immediately. Rosie followed him toward the orange line, taking short, careful steps. Ethan held the leash loosely at first. Maggie stood near the wall. Tucker had been left behind the barrier with a food puzzle, complaining loudly about the injustice. Rosie reached the line and hesitated. Maggie's body changed. The shift was small enough that someone unfamiliar with dogs might have missed it. Her mouth closed, shoulders rose, tail lowered, and her head came forward. Rachel saw it. "Stop there." Ethan looked at Rosie's paws. "She isn't panicking." I said stop. "I just want to see if Maggie reacts to distance or direction." Rachel's voice hardened. "Then watch what she's already telling you." Ethan took one more step. Rosie followed because the leash did. Her front paw slid half an inch on the polished linoleum. Maggie moved between them. No barking, no lunging. She simply occupied the space. Ethan turned slightly, intending to guide Rosie around her. Maggie lowered her head and stared directly at his arm. The warning was unmistakable. Ethan saw it and continued anyway. Maggie struck fast. Her teeth closed around the sleeve of his Navy working uniform Type 3, just below the elbow, hard enough to twist the fabric but not hard enough to break skin. He released almost immediately and backed toward Rosie. For one long second, nobody moved. The only sound was Tucker whining beyond the door. Rachel took the leash from Ethan. She did not shout at Maggie. She did not comfort Ethan either. "Outside." Ethan looked at the undamaged sleeve, then at Maggie. He could have blamed the dog. She had put teeth on him. That fact did not disappear simply because she had given warnings first. But another fact sat beside it, less flattering. Ethan had understood every warning and stepped forward anyway. "That was mine," he said quietly. Rachel studied him for a moment. "Mostly." It was not forgiveness, it was accuracy. Rosie's veterinary examination was moved forward that afternoon. Dr. Emily Parker arrived from the shelter clinic carrying a stethoscope, a rubber-backed mat, and the impatient efficiency of someone accustomed to animals who could not explain where they hurt. Emily was 44, medium height and strong through the shoulders, with warm brown skin, dark curly hair pulled into a loose bun, and rectangular glasses that constantly slid down her nose when she leaned over an examination table. Fine lines around her eyes deepened whenever she concentrated. She had practiced shelter medicine for 17 years and possessed a dry humor that surfaced most often when people became overly certain. A badly handled case early in her career had shaped that trait. She had once dismissed an elderly dog's repeated refusal to climb stairs as stubbornness before discovering a spinal injury. The dog recovered, but Emily never forgot the embarrassment of having mistaken inability for defiance. "Animals are very good at making us feel intelligent right before they prove otherwise," she told Ethan as she crouched beside Rosie. The puppy tolerated the examination without much fuss, though Rosie repeatedly turned her right ear toward Emily's fingers and failed to react consistently to a soft click made on her left side. Inside the left ear canal, Emily found inflammation and evidence of an infection that had likely been present for some time. Rosie also showed a mild vestibular imbalance. Nothing suggested catastrophic neurological damage, but the combination explained several details from the previous day: the delayed response to sounds from one side, the head tilt, and the uncertainty on slick flooring. Emily placed Rosie on the smooth hallway surface and let her walk voluntarily. The puppy widened her stance almost immediately. Her hind feet slipped once. Maggie, watching through the open doorway, rose. Emily then laid the rubber-backed mat across the same section. Rosie stepped onto it. Her body relaxed. She crossed the orange line without slipping. Maggie watched but did not move. Nobody celebrated. Rachel simply leaned against the wall and looked at the evaluation sheet she had filled out the day before. So Maggie knew. Maggie noticed, Emily corrected. That doesn't mean Maggie understands ear infections. Ethan looked toward the mother dog. Maggie was sniffing Rosie's face, then licking carefully along the affected ear. She knew enough. Emily nodded. Enough to know that one puppy moved differently. That distinction mattered. Humans loved stories in which animals possessed mysterious wisdom because such stories made the world feel kinder and more enchanted. The reality was both simpler and more impressive. Maggie had spent every hour beside Rosie. She knew the rhythm of the puppy's steps, the way her balance changed on certain surfaces, the exact instant uncertainty entered her body. What appeared supernatural from a distance might simply be attention practiced without distraction. Yet the examination of Maggie herself prevented anyone from turning her into a saint. Emily found soreness in both hips, worse on the right, probably aggravated by poor nutrition and the physical strain of nursing. During feeding, Maggie stiffened when Tucker pushed toward her bowl. When Tucker ignored the warning and shoved past Rosie, Maggie snapped at him sharply enough to make the puppy yelp and retreat. There was no injury, but Emily watched carefully. Pain lowers patience, she said, and guarding resources doesn't become harmless just because we understand where it came from. Rachel nodded. The temporary behavior note would be amended, not erased. Protective behavior around Rosie had context. Food guarding and excessive correction still required management. Ethan found himself strangely relieved by that. Maggie did not need to become innocent for him to admit he had been wrong. She could be protective, frightened, sore, intelligent, and capable of dangerous decisions all at once. Human beings were rarely offered that complexity without complaint. Perhaps dogs deserved it too. Late that afternoon, the shelter had grown quieter. Rachel called Ethan into the small office behind reception. 3 folders lay side by side on her desk. Tucker's had a yellow transfer tag clipped to it. Rosie's had a handwritten note from a foster coordinator. Maggie's carried a red behavioral review sheet. Rachel tapped the first folder. Tucker leaves Friday morning for the puppy placement program. Her finger moved to the second. Rosie goes Friday afternoon to a medical foster who can continue treatment. Then Maggie's. Behavioral rescue can take Maggie Saturday. Ethan looked from one folder to the next. Yesterday the arrangement had seemed practical, perhaps even sensible. Today it looked different. Tucker was not dependent on Maggie in the same way Rosie seemed to be. Rosie's medical problem was treatable. Maggie's behavior had already been partly misunderstood. Separating them might still be necessary. Ethan understood that. But necessity deserved more scrutiny than convenience. Is there a way to keep them together? He asked. Rachel leaned back in her chair. Yes. Ethan waited. One qualified placement willing to take responsibility for all 3. Stable housing, veterinary follow-up, behavioral management, a realistic plan for travel or emergencies. Not somebody who sees a sad situation on Thursday and regrets 3 German Shepherds by Monday morning. Ethan looked through the office window. Maggie lay beside Rosie in the adjoining kennel, while Tucker chewed enthusiastically on something he was almost certainly not supposed to have. Ethan felt the familiar urge to decide immediately. To say yes because action was easier than uncertainty. Rachel watched his face and seemed to recognize it. Don't answer me now, she said. That would be exactly the wrong reason to answer. Ethan exhaled through his nose. You always this encouraging? Only with people who need discouraging first. He almost smiled. Then he looked again at the 3 folders. So there is a way. Rachel's expression softened, but only slightly. There is. But they don't need another person who feels sorry for them today. She placed her hand over the folders. They need someone who will still be there on Monday. Ethan Walker's rental house stood on the quieter western edge of Lexington, where subdivisions gave way to fenced pasture and the evenings carried the smell of damp grass instead of traffic. By Thursday morning, the sky had cleared into a thin autumn blue, but Ethan barely noticed it. He sat at his kitchen table with Rachel's sentence still lodged somewhere uncomfortable in his mind. They need someone who will still be there on Monday. The table in front of him looked less like the beginning of an adoption and more like preparation for an inspection. A legal pad held columns of numbers: food, vaccinations, Rosie's ear treatment, follow-up examinations, medication for Maggie's hips, training, emergency veterinary care, replacement costs for whatever Tucker eventually decided belonged inside his mouth. Ethan had even written fence repair and underlined it twice. The back fence was 6 feet tall, but old enough that 2 boards had warped away from the posts. One determined German Shepherd could turn that weakness into a lesson very quickly. 3 could turn it into a neighborhood event. Ethan leaned back and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Feeling sorry for the dogs had been simple. Feeding 3 German Shepherds for years was arithmetic. Caring for a puppy with hearing impairment was planning. Managing a mother dog who guarded food and had already put teeth on his sleeve was responsibility. Those things were not romantic, and Ethan found himself oddly grateful for that. Romance had almost made him answer Rachel too quickly. He called Dr. Emily Parker first. Emily answered from the shelter clinic with the muffled noise of stainless steel instruments behind her. "If you're asking whether 3 German Shepherds eat like 1 medium dog multiplied by 3, she said after hearing him out, "the answer is no. Somehow they eat like 5. Ethan wrote another figure beside food. Emily became more serious when they discussed Maggie. The dog's hip discomfort did not currently require surgery, but weight management, controlled exercise, anti-inflammatory medication when indicated, and future monitoring would matter. Rosie's ear infection was treatable, though her reduced hearing on the left might remain. "Don't build your plan around making Rosie normal," Emily told him. "Build it around making her life easy to understand." Ethan stared at the sentence on his paper. It was a distinction he would once have considered sentimental. Now it sounded practical. He asked about Maggie's resource guarding. Emily told him not to make food a contest, separate feeding areas, predictable routines, no reaching into bowls simply to prove ownership. "You don't need her to believe you're stronger," Emily said. "You need her to believe you're consistent." Ethan almost laughed. Consistency sounded easy until it applied to someone whose instincts disagreed with his. His next call was to Karen Blake, the behavioral consultant Rachel recommended. Karen was 52, a compact woman with olive skin, dark hair streaked heavily with silver, and the quiet posture of someone who had spent decades entering rooms without making frightened dogs feel cornered. She had worked with shelter and working dogs for nearly 25 years. Her reputation came not from dramatic transformations, but from a habit of disappointing owners who wanted dramatic answers. Karen believed behavior was rarely solved by one clever technique. "Maggie is not a puzzle you finish," she told Ethan during the video consultation. "She's an animal whose choices make sense to her. Your job is to make better choices easier." She asked about Ethan's work schedule, doors, flooring, feeding areas, visitors, and whether he had any intention of putting Maggie through obedience exercises simply because he was accustomed to trained working dogs. Ethan hesitated long enough that Karen smiled without humor. That pause answered me. He felt mildly insulted, which probably meant she had found the right subject. Ethan had spent years around military working dogs and handlers. He respected precision. He respected reliable commands. Somewhere beneath that respect lived the dangerous assumption that successful relationships were measurable by response. Karen made him confront another possibility. Maggie might learn to trust him without ever becoming the kind of dog who looked impressive in a demonstration. The work question was harder. Ethan drove to the training facility and found Lieutenant Commander Mark Collins reviewing schedules in a small office overlooking the exercise grounds. Collins was 48, stocky rather than tall, with a square, weathered face, short iron-gray hair, and a close-cropped beard that made him look permanently prepared for cold weather. He had known Ethan for nearly a decade, and had the unusual ability to criticize him without raising his voice. A shoulder injury years earlier had taken Collins out of certain operational assignments, and the experience had stripped him of his old belief that useful people were always the ones doing the most. "3 dogs?" Collins said when Ethan explained. "You don't do hobbies in moderation, do you?" Ethan ignored that. Collins checked the upcoming calendar. Ethan would remain based in Kentucky for the foreseeable future, but there were 2 short training blocks outside the state over the next several months, with more possible later. No guarantee existed that his schedule would stay convenient. "If your plan only works when the Navy behaves itself," Collins said, "you don't have a plan." Ethan wrote the dates down. That afternoon he dealt with the fence. Then he called Susan Miller, his 63-year-old neighbor 2 houses down, a retired veterinary technician with short white blonde hair, sturdy shoulders, blue eyes that missed very little, and the dry patience of a woman who had spent 37 years being scratched by animals and argued with by their owners. Ethan knew Susan well enough to exchange tools, collect packages, and occasionally fix the stubborn latch on her garden gate, but not well enough to ask casually for help with 3 dogs. He explained the entire situation, including Maggie's bite to his sleeve. Susan did not react with either fear or admiration. "Good," she said. "Now I know what I'd actually be agreeing to." She would not become their full-time sitter, but she agreed to serve as an emergency contact and help with short check-ins after meeting the dogs under controlled conditions. Ethan arranged a professional caregiver recommended by Karen for longer absences. It cost more than he wanted. He added the number to his list anyway. That evening, Ethan stood alone in the spare room he intended to convert into a quiet area for Maggie. He had moved the storage boxes out and placed a washable bed against the wall, leaving enough space that a dog could choose distance from the doorway. In the kitchen, 3 stainless steel bowls sat on the counter, still bearing their store labels. He felt foolish looking at them. They were objects purchased for animals he did not yet own, and for a moment he wondered whether the entire exercise was less about helping Maggie than about repairing the uncomfortable memory of ignoring her warning. Guilt could imitate generosity remarkably well. Ethan knew that from people. A person made a mistake, felt ashamed, and then rushed into some oversized act of goodness because living with patience was harder than performing redemption. He did not want 3 dogs to become evidence in his private argument that he was still a decent man. If he adopted them, Maggie was not required to forgive him. Rosie was not required to improve on his schedule. Tucker was certainly not required to become convenient. That realization made the decision harder. It also made it cleaner. Friday morning, Ethan returned to Bluegrass Animal Rescue with a folder instead of an emotional speech. Inside were veterinary estimates, confirmation of the fence repairs, his work calendar, Karen's behavioral recommendations, proof that his lease permitted multiple large dogs, Susan's emergency contact information, and details for the professional caregiver. Rachel sat behind her desk reading everything slowly. She wore a faded green sweater over her scrubs that morning, and tired shadows sat beneath her eyes after another overnight intake. Ethan expected the process to feel like an accusation. Instead, what irritated him most was Rachel's refusal to be impressed. She asked what he would do if Maggie never became comfortable around visitors. He asked whether Rosie's hearing difficulty would change his decision. She asked what happened when Tucker reached 70 pounds and discovered adolescence. Ethan answered each question. When he did not know, he said so. That last answer was the hardest. While Rachel processed the application, she worked on something of her own. Across the desk lay several pages headed, Maternal Protective Behavior Review. Maggie's case had forced her to reconsider how quickly a shelter under pressure converted observations into labels. Rachel was not proposing that every growl earned days of expensive testing. She knew better than most that time itself was a scarce resource. Instead, she drafted a narrower rule. When a mother dog showed selective protective behavior toward one puppy rather than generalized aggression, staff should check for pain, illness, sensory impairment, or environmental triggers before separating the family or finalizing a dangerous behavior notation. It was not heroic policy. It might save only a few animals from being misunderstood. Rachel had spent enough years in rescue to know that systems rarely change through miracles. They change through one annoying additional question on a form. The approval came late that morning, only hours before Tucker's scheduled transfer. Ethan signed his name 3 times. Rachel signed beneath him 3 times. No one applauded. Tucker celebrated by trying to steal a pen. Getting them out of the building proved harder. Rosie stepped onto the first rubber-backed runner Rachel had placed along the hallway. Tucker charged after her, skidding only because enthusiasm remained stronger than coordination. Maggie reached the kennel door and stopped. The polished linoleum stretched beyond the runner farther ahead. Ethan held her leash loosely, but when she leaned backward, his hand tightened by instinct. Maggie froze. Ethan felt the tension travel through the leash into his palm. 2 days earlier, he would have pulled. He let the leash soften. "More mats," he said. Rachel and another employee laid rubber runners from the kennel almost all the way to the rear exit. Rosie crossed first. Tucker bounced behind her, stopping halfway only to investigate a speck of something that might once have been food. Maggie remained where she was. Nobody called her. Nobody pulled. Ethan waited near the open rear door. For nearly a minute, Maggie simply looked at the hallway, then at Rosie, then at Ethan. Her weight shifted forward. One paw touched the first mat and withdrew. She tried again. This time she left it there. Then came the second paw. Maggie walked slowly after her puppies. Ethan did not praise her loudly or tighten a leash or pretend he had accomplished something. For the first time since meeting her, he was taking Maggie somewhere without needing to win the argument about how she should get there. The first evening at Ethan Walker's house was cool and clear, with dry autumn leaves scraping along the back fence and the last pale light settling across the fields beyond western Lexington. For the first 10 minutes, everything looked almost embarrassingly peaceful. Maggie walked through the back door slowly. Rosie followed over a rubber runner Ethan had placed across the kitchen floor, and Tucker entered as though the house had been built specifically for his entertainment. Then Tucker found Ethan's left slipper. The 9-week-old German Shepherd seized it by the heel, dragged it beneath the dining table, and chewed through one side before Ethan finished carrying the last bag in from the truck. 10 minutes, Ethan muttered, staring at the ruined leather. Tucker wagged his half-raised ears and looked delighted with himself. There was something almost useful about the puppy's shamelessness. Tucker did not care about fresh starts, emotional symbolism, or whether Ethan had made a responsible decision. He cared about food, movement, smells, and whether leather was technically edible. Rosie moved through the house differently. She stayed close to walls and rugs, avoiding the broad stretches of hard wood whenever possible. When Ethan called her from behind, Rosie sometimes continued walking until she saw Maggie turn toward his voice. If he spoke from Rosie's right side, she found him quickly. If he spoke from the left, she often turned the wrong way first. Once, attempting to pivot too quickly beside the kitchen island, she stumbled onto her shoulder. Ethan instinctively stepped toward her, but Maggie reached Rosie first, touching her muzzle to the puppy's neck before looking at Ethan as if assessing whether he intended to interfere. Maggie chose the laundry room before sunset. Ethan had prepared the spare bedroom as a quiet retreat, but Maggie ignored it completely. The laundry room was smaller, enclosed on 3 sides, with one doorway and a clear view into the kitchen. Perhaps it resembled the room where she had survived with her puppies. Perhaps it simply gave her fewer directions to monitor. Human beings had a habit of giving emotional meaning to every choice an animal made, Ethan thought. Sometimes a room was only a room. Still, Maggie settled beside the wall and placed her body between the doorway and the puppies whenever they wandered back to her. Ethan put water nearby and placed her food several feet inside. When he stepped toward the bowl later to straighten the mat beneath it, Maggie's head snapped up. Her body stiffened. A low growl rolled through her chest. Ethan stopped. He knew what he was supposed to do. Back away. Do not challenge. Do not turn feeding into a contest. Emily and Karen had both made that clear. Yet a small, stubborn part of him bristled at being warned away from a bowl sitting on his own floor in his own house. The thought embarrassed him almost as soon as it appeared. Ownership was a human concept. Maggie did not know whose name was on the lease. She knew only that food had once become scarce and that a man was moving toward it. Ethan stepped back. Maggie watched until he disappeared from the doorway. By the second day, Ethan had turned the kitchen counter into an operational board. 3 feeding times were written down. Medication was logged. Walks were scheduled separately. Rosie's eardrops had a box beside them for morning and evening checks. Toys were divided into supervised and unsupervised categories. Maggie had a designated resting area. Tucker had a crate. Rosie had a padded bed beside a non-slip runner. Ethan even mapped the simplest route from the kitchen to the yard, so Rosie would encounter as little bare flooring as possible. On paper, the arrangement looked excellent. In practice, Tucker did not respect paper. He attempted to steal Rosie's breakfast, discovered how to nose open the lower cabinet containing cleaning cloths, and managed to carry one of Ethan's socks into the yard without anyone seeing him do it. Rosie objected to the washing machine. The first time Ethan ran a load, the machine shifted into its spin cycle with a heavy metallic thump. Rosie jumped so violently that her back feet slid apart. Maggie was beside her immediately. From that point on, whenever Ethan approached the machine, Maggie watched him with narrowed eyes. Ethan moved the laundry schedule to times when the dogs were outside. Then he caught himself becoming irritated that his own washing machine required strategy. "This is ridiculous," he said once to the empty kitchen. Tucker, chewing a cardboard tube, appeared to agree enthusiastically. Ethan responded to disorder the way he always had. He tightened the system. Meals happened at exact times. Doors opened only after the dogs paused. Tucker was redirected immediately when he became too rough. Ethan shortened his verbal cues until the house filled with crisp sounds. Wait, back, leave, here. None of those rules was unreasonable by itself. The problem was the pressure accumulating behind them. Ethan began watching every mistake. Tucker felt it least because Tucker considered correction another form of attention. Rosie became hesitant. Maggie noticed everything. When Ethan moved quickly, Maggie lifted her head. When his voice sharpened, her ears angled forward. When he blocked Tucker from entering the laundry room, Maggie stood. Ethan told himself that predictability was kindness. He was not entirely wrong. But predictability delivered through constant control was beginning to resemble surveillance. The moment that exposed it came on the 4th evening. Ethan had just placed 3 water bowls near the kitchen wall after cleaning them. Tucker sprinted after a rolling rubber ball, collided with the nearest bowl, and sent it skidding across the tile. Metal struck a cabinet with a violent clang. Rosie, startled, spun toward the wrong direction and slipped hard enough that her legs folded beneath her. Maggie exploded out of the laundry room. She did not bite. She did not even approach Ethan directly. She threw herself between him and the puppies, shoulders high, head low, forcing Rosie and Tucker behind her. Tucker stopped playing. Rosie pressed against Maggie's hind leg. Ethan, already tired from a long training day and irritated by the water spreading across the floor, reacted before he thought. "Enough!" His voice cracked through the room with the command force he used on men who were expected to respond immediately. Silence followed. Maggie backed away, not from the spilled water, from him. She turned her body sideways, gathering both puppies behind her, and retreated into the laundry room. Rosie followed so closely that her shoulder brushed Maggie's belly. Even Tucker, who usually regarded fear as an inconvenience, lowered his head and disappeared after them. Ethan stood alone in the kitchen holding a towel. The house suddenly felt too quiet. He had spent days trying to build safety through structure, yet in one sharp word he had reminded 3 frightened animals that the largest creature in the house could change the atmosphere whenever he wanted. Nothing about his command had been abusive. Nothing about it would have alarmed anyone on a military training field. That was precisely the problem. Context changed meaning. A voice appropriate in one world could become a threat in another. Ethan cleaned the water and left the dogs alone. 20 minutes later, he called Rachel. "I screwed it up." Rachel did not immediately reassure him. What happened? He told her everything, including the growl near Maggie's bowl 2 days earlier, and the increasingly rigid routine. "You're trying to make the house predictable," Rachel said. "Yes." "For whom?" Ethan leaned against the counter. Rachel continued. "Call Karen." Karen Blake listened to the same story later that evening. "Rules aren't the problem," she said. "Your need to seek compliance is." "That sounds dramatic." "So did getting bitten after somebody told you to stop." Ethan sighed. Karen recommended something simple. Maggie needed a clearly defined resting area where Ethan would not approach casually, reposition bowls, adjust bedding, or test her tolerance. She suggested a visible boundary, not because Maggie understood colored tape as law, but because Ethan needed a physical reminder. The next morning, he drove to a hardware store and bought a roll of bright orange tape. He placed a strip across the laundry room entrance. Tucker immediately tried to chew it. Ethan moved him away and stared at the line. At the shelter, orange tape had marked where dogs were expected to perform. Here, it marked where Ethan was expected to stop. Unless there was a medical necessity or emergency, if Maggie was resting behind that line, he would leave her alone. He would not reach for a bowl because it looked crooked. He would not step inside simply because he wanted her to become accustomed to him. He would wait. The rule irritated him more than he expected. That was how he knew he needed it. Several days passed. The household remained imperfect. Tucker destroyed another sock. Rosie still startled when something struck metal. Maggie still watched Ethan carefully around food. But the constant tension began loosening, by degrees too small to celebrate. One evening, Ethan stood at the kitchen counter slicing vegetables for dinner. Tucker trotted in first and stationed himself beneath the cutting board, apparently convinced carrots occasionally transformed into meat when dropped. Rosie followed more slowly, using the runner, then settled near the refrigerator. Maggie appeared at the laundry room doorway, her front paws stopped behind the orange line. Ethan saw her without turning his head completely. He did not call. He did not crouch. He did not reach for a treat. He kept cutting vegetables. 1 minute passed, then another. Maggie looked at Tucker. She looked at Rosie. Finally, she looked at Ethan. One paw crossed the orange line, then the other. Maggie walked into the kitchen and lay down several feet from his boots. Ethan continued slicing carrots. He understood enough now not to ruin the moment by claiming it. For once, the distance between them had become smaller, without either of them being forced to surrender it. By the 3rd week of October, the mornings around Lexington had turned cooler, and the grass behind Ethan Walker's house stayed silver with dew until the sun climbed over the pasture. Inside, the household had become quieter in some ways and more complicated in others. Rosie's ear infection had responded well to treatment. The swelling had gone down, her head tilt appeared less often, and with rubber runners laid through the kitchen and hallway, she could move without the careful, wide-legged steps that had worried everyone at the shelter. Her hearing on the left side remained weaker, but Ethan had learned to approach from her right, or make sure she could see him before giving a cue. Rosie, now a little heavier and stronger, had begun to show a personality that had been hidden beneath uncertainty. She liked carrying fallen leaves into the house one at a time. She preferred soft toys over ropes. She would sit in the yard watching birds for long stretches, not chasing them, simply studying them, as if she suspected they were discussing her. Ethan found himself smiling at that. Improvement, he was learning, did not always look like a dog becoming faster or more obedient. Sometimes it looked like a puppy finally having enough spare attention to become curious. Tucker had improved too, though mostly in size. At nearly 12 weeks, his paws seemed to grow overnight. His shoulders had broadened, and his ears had finally begun standing for longer than a few seconds at a time. His confidence remained gloriously inconvenient. If Rosie received a toy, Tucker wanted that toy. If Ethan knelt beside Rosie, Tucker shoved his entire body between them. If 3 bowls were placed 6 feet apart, Tucker ate his own portion at alarming speed and then checked the other 2 as if quality control were his sacred duty. At first, Maggie handled him with remarkable patience. He blocked him with her shoulder, turned her head away, or gave a low warning when he pushed too far. But as the weeks passed, Ethan noticed the corrections becoming sharper. One morning, Tucker tried to muscle into Rosie's bowl while Maggie was already tense from a cold night that had left her right hip stiff. Maggie spun and snapped so quickly that Tucker screamed before her teeth even touched him. He threw himself backward, startled more than injured, and hid beneath a kitchen chair. Maggie stood over the space he had occupied, breathing hard. Ethan froze several feet away. The old version of him would have stepped in immediately and corrected Maggie. The newer version watched first. Maggie's weight was shifted off her right hind leg. Her mouth remained tight. Rosie stood behind her. Tucker, after 30 seconds, crawled out and attempted to steal a dish towel, as though emotional recovery were simply another task to complete before breakfast. Ethan called Karen Blake that afternoon. Karen arrived the next day carrying no training bag, no dramatic equipment, and nothing more impressive than a notebook and a pouch of treats. At 52, she remained compact and quiet, with silver heavy dark hair cut just above her shoulders and olive skin lined lightly around the eyes. Her calmness did not come from softness. Years of working with dogs had taught her that rushing toward a problem often made people feel useful while making the problem worse. She watched Maggie, Rosie, and Tucker together for nearly 40 minutes before saying much. Tucker interrupted Rosie 4 times. Maggie intercepted him 3 times. The 4th time she stayed down but lifted her head immediately. "There," Karen said. Ethan looked over. "What?" "She never stops working." Ethan frowned. Karen nodded toward Maggie. "You keep thinking keeping the puppies close makes her feel safe. Watch her body. He's tracking both of them constantly." Maggie's eyes moved from Tucker to Rosie, then back again. "She's their mother." "Yes, and she's sore, underweight, adjusting to a new home, and behaving like she believes every bad decision in the room belongs to her." Ethan leaned against the counter. "So separate them?" The word sounded harsher than he meant it to. "Give them individual time," Karen corrected. "That is not abandonment." She pointed toward Tucker, who was attempting to drag Rosie's blanket across the floor, while Rosie still had one paw on it. "He needs to learn that another dog saying no is not the beginning of negotiations. Rosie needs experiences where nobody steps in front of her before she gets to make a choice. Maggie needs to discover that resting does not cause disaster." The idea bothered Ethan more than he expected. He had spent the first weeks trying to preserve the family after nearly watching the shelter split them into 3 destinations. Somewhere along the way, he had quietly turned togetherness into proof that he had made the right decision. Karen recognized it. Keeping a family together and keeping a family attached at the hip are not the same thing, she said. You saved them from unnecessary separation. Don't make closeness compulsory just because separation once scared you. So Ethan changed the routine again, but this time the change was less about control and more about giving each dog room to become something beyond its role inside the family. Tucker began eating behind a baby gate, where he could see the others but could not raid their bowls. He protested the arrangement with offended little grunts, then discovered that his own food remained available even when another dog was eating nearby. Ethan introduced short one-on-one play sessions in the yard, teaching Tucker that toys appeared and disappeared without requiring theft. The puppy still cheated whenever possible, but he slowly began pausing before bulldozing into Rosie. Rosie received quiet periods outside with Ethan, while Maggie remained inside. The first time Rosie stopped 3 times and looked back at the door. Ethan did not lure her farther. He sat on the grass and waited. Eventually Rosie wandered toward a patch of leaves, sniffed them, sneezed violently, and looked offended by autumn itself. She ventured farther the next day. By the 4th session, she explored the fence line without checking the door every few seconds. Maggie found separation hardest. When Ethan took Tucker into the yard alone, she stood at the back door. When Rosie went outside without her, Maggie paced once from the kitchen to the hallway and back. Ethan kept the sessions brief. He did not ask Maggie to lie down. He did not praise her for being calm. Karen had warned him not to turn relaxation into another assignment. At first, Maggie waited until every puppy returned before settling. Several days later, while Rosie was outside with Ethan, Maggie lowered herself onto her bed. She kept her head up, ears pointed toward the door. A minute later, her chin touched the blanket. Ethan saw it through the window and deliberately looked away. There was a tenderness in refusing to witness too aggressively, he thought. Human beings often ruined small acts of trust by rushing toward them with celebration. Meanwhile, Rachel Morgan was dealing with a different kind of pressure at Bluegrass Animal Rescue. She had assembled Maggie's behavioral records, Rosie's medical findings, and the timeline of the family's intake into a preliminary case file for an upcoming fundraising and board meeting. The shelter's communications coordinator, Jessica Reed, reviewed the draft with her. Jessica was 36, petite, with straight chestnut hair cut to her collarbones, light brown skin, quick dark eyes, and the polished friendliness of someone who spent most of her week asking strangers to care about things they had never seen. She was not dishonest, but she understood that donors remembered stories more easily than procedures. "The cleanest angle is obvious," Jessica said during a call with Ethan. "Navy SEAL keeps German Shepherd mother and 2 puppies from being separated." Ethan was silent long enough that Jessica added, "I'm not saying we lie. You're saying we simplify. That's what communication is." "Sometimes." Jessica asked what he wanted included. "The bite." She paused. "The sleeve incident? The resource guarding, too. And the night I yelled and scared all 3? That makes the story harder." "Good." Rachel, listening from the other end, said nothing. Ethan continued. "If you make Maggie look perfect, then the lesson becomes that animals deserve patience only when they turn out to be secretly wonderful. She isn't perfect. Neither am I." Jessica sighed quietly. She was not offended. In fact, part of her respected the objection. Years in nonprofit work had taught her how easily compassion could become theater. "Fine," she said, "but nobody donates to a spreadsheet." "Then tell the truth like a story." Rachel finally smiled. That evening, back at the house, Ethan fed the dogs separately. Tucker finished first and actually waited behind the gate for several seconds before protesting. Rosie wandered beneath the small table beside the kitchen and fell asleep there, one ear angled toward the room. Maggie lay on her bed near the living room wall. Tucker eventually settled in his own bed across the room after performing 3 unnecessary circles and biting the corner of it once. The house became still. Maggie lifted her head. She looked toward Rosie, then toward Tucker. Ethan watched from the couch, expecting her to stand and gather them closer as she had done so many times before. Maggie rose halfway, paused, then lowered herself again. She turned once on the bed, stretched her front legs forward, and placed her head between her paws. Rosie remained beneath the table. Tucker remained across the room. Maggie closed her eyes. No one had disappeared. No one had been taken away. For the first time since Ethan had known her, the mother dog slept while both of her puppies rested beyond the reach of her body. A few feet of distance had stopped meaning loss. By early November, Lexington had traded autumn gold for bare branches, colder mornings, and a thin frost that whitened the pasture fences before sunrise. Ethan Walker had finally stopped waking each morning expecting something in the house to go wrong. Rosie could cross the kitchen without losing her footing. Tucker had learned that the baby gate separating his food from everyone else's was not a personal insult, although he still tested that theory at least once a day. Maggie took her medication without protest if it arrived inside a small piece of chicken, slept more deeply, and no longer rose every time one of her puppies left the room. The household was not peaceful in any grand sense. Tucker still stole socks with criminal creativity, Rosie occasionally startled when a sound came from her weaker side, and Maggie remained suspicious of unexpected visitors. But the problems had become ordinary. Ethan had spent most of his life respecting ordinary stability only after losing it. That was why the email from Lieutenant Commander Mark Collins bothered him more than it should have. Ethan was assigned to a mandatory 10-day training block at a facility in Virginia. He read the message twice, then opened the calendar he already knew by memory. 10 days, 3 dogs, one mother who had only recently learned she could sleep without both puppies touching her. His first thought was not how to manage the trip. His first thought was how to get out of it. Mark Collins listened without interrupting when Ethan called. "You're asking to be replaced?" Mark finally said. Ethan stood at the kitchen window watching Tucker attempt to dig under a shrub while Rosie investigated the hole from a safer distance. Maggie lay on the porch, tracking both puppies with her eyes but not moving. "I'm asking if someone else can cover this block." "Why?" "The dogs aren't ready." Mark was silent just long enough to make Ethan uncomfortable. "That an animal behavior assessment or a personal preference?" Ethan's jaw tightened. Mark had known him too long. "They've made progress." "Then make a care plan." "Maggie doesn't handle change well." "Neither do you." Ethan nearly ended the call there. Instead, he said he would confirm by the end of the day. His next call went to Rachel. He expected her to understand. She did, which turned out to be worse. Rachel listened while Ethan explained Maggie's medication, Rosie's exercises, Tucker's feeding routine, the importance of keeping the orange boundary near Maggie's resting area, and the possibility that 10 days away could undo weeks of progress. When he finished, Rachel asked, "Do you think they'll be unsafe?" Ethan paused. "No." "Do you think they'll stop eating?" "Probably not." "Do you think Maggie will panic if you arrange people she already knows and keep the routine consistent?" Another pause. "I don't know." Rachel's voice softened. "Then maybe the real question isn't whether they're ready for you to leave." Ethan looked through the glass at Maggie. "What is it?" "Maybe you're not ready for them to be okay without you." The sentence irritated him because it landed too close to the truth. Ethan had spent the first weeks learning not to control Maggie's movements. Somewhere along the way, control had quietly disguised itself as responsibility. If every improvement depended on him, then every routine mattered because he maintained it. Every calm night mattered because he had created it. Every successful meal proved something about his usefulness. That interpretation felt noble until he examined it closely. A home in which everything collapsed when one person left was not stability. It was dependence with better furniture. Ethan called Karen Blake, who agreed that a controlled absence could be useful if handled carefully. He then hired Laura Bennett, a 57-year-old professional pet caregiver recommended by Karen. Laura was a broad-shouldered woman of average height, with short silver-brown hair, weathered fair skin, and deep-set green eyes that seemed to observe without staring. She had spent 18 years working with anxious and medically complicated dogs after leaving a career as an elementary school aide. A serious bite from a frightened rescue dog early in her pet care work had taught her not to interpret compliance as comfort. Laura did not enter Ethan's house with baby talk or outstretched hands. She sat sideways at the kitchen table while Maggie watched from the laundry room entrance and waited until Tucker approached first. Tucker immediately shoved his nose into her coat pocket. "Well," Laura said, "at least one of us has completed the interview." Rosie approached later from Laura's right side. Maggie stayed behind the orange line for most of the visit, then eventually lay down. Ethan noticed that he had been holding his shoulders rigid the entire time. The final plan was deliberately unheroic. Laura would handle morning and evening care. Susan Miller would serve as an emergency local contact and stop in for short midday visits when needed. Emily Parker would remain available for medical questions and check Maggie if her hip pain worsened. Rachel would be a backup if a behavioral problem appeared. Karen had written a brief set of instructions emphasizing what not to do. No forcing Maggie from her resting area, no testing her food tolerance, no dragging Rosie over slick surfaces, no letting Tucker rehearse stealing everyone's meal simply because it was funny the first 2 times. Ethan printed copies and placed them in a folder on the counter. Then he made a second folder. Laura looked at both and raised an eyebrow. Do I need a third in case the first two become emotionally overwhelmed? Ethan actually laughed. The morning he left, he did not give the dogs a dramatic goodbye. Karen had specifically advised against turning departure into an event. He fed them, checked Rosie's ear, gave Maggie her medication, removed another sock from Tucker's mouth, and carried his bag toward the door. Tucker followed until he noticed breakfast crumbs under the table. Rosie watched Ethan leave with her head angled slightly right. Maggie remained on her bed. Ethan paused with his hand on the doorknob, wanting some sign that leaving mattered. Maggie blinked once. That was all. The 10 days that followed were almost offensively uneventful. Laura sent one short update each evening. Maggie ate. Rosie completed her balance exercises. Tucker found a gardening glove in Susan's jacket pocket and spent 20 minutes trying to smuggle it beneath the sofa. On day 3, Maggie refused breakfast until Laura warmed the food slightly. On day 5, Rosie slipped while turning too quickly, but immediately stood again without distress. On day 7, Tucker escaped the baby gate because Laura had not latched it completely and consumed half of Rosie's meal before being discovered. No one died. No trust collapsed. No dog ran down a highway searching for Ethan. Maggie continued taking her medication, slept in her usual place, and tolerated Laura's presence without being required to love her. Ethan read the updates at night from Virginia and experienced an emotion he disliked admitting. Disappointment mixed with relief. He wanted them safe, of course he did, but some stubborn piece of him had expected his absence to matter more. Human beings often claimed they wanted those they loved to become independent, while secretly hoping to remain indispensable. Ethan had seen parents do it with adult children, leaders do it with younger officers, spouses do it with one another. He had never expected to discover the same vanity through 3 German shepherds. While Ethan was away, Rachel faced a less personal version of the same question at Bluegrass Animal Rescue. How much control could a system afford to give up before chaos followed? She presented her proposal to the shelter's board in a fluorescent-lit conference room adjoining the administration wing. The board chair, Charles Whitman, was 66, tall and narrow with thinning white hair, a clean-shaven face, pale blue eyes, and the careful manners of a retired accountant who trusted numbers more than emotional appeals. Charles had donated to animal organizations for years, but believed overcrowded shelters failed when compassion outran capacity. 2 other board members worried that Rachel's proposed additional evaluation step would slow transfers and consume staff hours they did not have. Rachel did not argue that Maggie's story proved every dog deserved days of special investigation. Instead, she presented the intake timeline, the original behavior notation, Rosie's medical findings, the altered placement risk, and the estimated cost of failed placements and returned animals. This isn't about giving every case unlimited time, she said. It's about recognizing when one extra question might prevent us from making the expensive decision twice. Charles tapped his pen against the table. He remained unconvinced, but he stopped calling the proposal sentimental. Rachel considered that progress. Maggie had begun as a frightened dog in an evaluation room. Now her case was becoming evidence, stripped of the heroic language Jessica had once wanted to wrap around it. On the 10th afternoon, Ethan's truck pulled into his driveway beneath a flat, gray Kentucky sky. He carried his bag through the side gate and stepped into the yard. Tucker saw him first and bounded several steps forward before becoming distracted by a leaf. Rosie stood near the porch and watched carefully. Maggie was drinking from the outdoor water bowl. Ethan stopped without meaning to. Some childish part of him expected her to lift her head, recognize him, and cross the yard. Maggie looked up. Their eyes met. Then she lowered her head and continued drinking. Ethan stared at her. Seriously? Tucker chose that moment to run past with one of Susan's old gardening gloves, still somehow in his possession. Ethan laughed to spite himself. That evening, the routines returned without ceremony: dinner, medication, a short walk, the lamp beside the couch. Ethan sat with a book open across his knees. Rosie slept beneath the kitchen table. Tucker occupied his own bed after being removed from Ethan's chair twice. Maggie entered the living room. She walked past Ethan without looking at him, turned once beside his chair, and lay down close enough that her shoulder nearly touched his boot. Within minutes, her breathing deepened. Ethan looked down at her, then back at the page. He did not reach for her. He did not say her name. He simply turned the page. For the first time, he understood that being loved was not the same thing as being required. And sometimes the safest proof that someone belonged was how calmly life could continue when they stepped away. 2 months later, winter had settled lightly over Lexington without turning the city white. The mornings were cold enough to silver the grass, the trees stood nearly bare, and the low Kentucky sky seemed to hold its light close to the ground. Maggie had changed during those 2 months, though not in the neat, dramatic way people like to describe change. Her coat had filled out over her ribs, her right hip bothered her less with medication and controlled exercise, and she could now watch Rosie or Tucker disappear into another room without immediately rising to follow. Rosie had grown into a slender young German shepherd with increasingly upright ears and a thoughtful habit of turning her right side toward unfamiliar sounds. Tucker had become taller, heavier, and almost offensively confident, with long legs he had not yet learned to organize, and a continuing belief that every unattended object in Ethan's house deserved investigation. Maggie still disliked sudden metallic sounds. She still watched strangers carefully. She still preferred having an exit visible whenever she entered a new room. Ethan no longer interpreted those things as failures. That change in himself was harder to measure. Rachel Morgan called on a Wednesday evening. Bluegrass Animal Rescue was hosting a small presentation for board members and donors the following Saturday. She wanted to show how Maggie's case had developed after the original behavioral assessment and how Rosie's medical condition had changed the interpretation of what everyone first thought they were seeing. "I'm not asking you to put on a show," Rachel said. That sentence usually means there's going to be a show. Rachel sighed. "Jessica has already promised there will be coffee. That's the entertainment budget." Ethan looked across the living room. Tucker was asleep upside down against the sofa. Rosie lay near the kitchen doorway. Maggie rested on her bed without touching either puppy. "What exactly do you want?" "Come in. Let them see the dogs. Answer questions, that's it." Ethan agreed. He told himself the decision was practical. Maggie had visited the veterinarian and tolerated new environments better. Rosie was steadier. Tucker considered strangers potential sources of snacks and therefore had almost no objection to public life. Ethan also knew that Rachel's proposal still faced resistance. If seeing the dogs helped people understand why context mattered, perhaps the visit was worth doing. What he did not fully admit was that he wanted them to see the progress, too. Saturday's meeting was supposed to involve fewer than 20 people. By the time Ethan pulled into the shelter parking lot, almost twice that number had arrived. 2 additional donors had brought guests. Jessica had invited a local photographer to document the fundraising portion. Folding chairs had been added along the walls, their metal legs scraping loudly across the floor as volunteers rearranged them. Ethan noticed Maggie's breathing change before they reached reception. Her mouth opened slightly. Her tongue appeared, though the hallway was cool. Her ears moved independently, tracking sounds. When a chair dragged suddenly across the tile, Maggie stopped. Rosie turned toward her mother. Tucker tried to investigate the photographer. "Give her space," Ethan said, keeping the leash loose. Rachel appeared from the conference room entrance. She wore charcoal slacks and a dark green blouse instead of her usual shelter clothes, but the tired, practical expression was unchanged. "This got bigger than planned," she said. "I noticed. We can leave." Ethan looked at Maggie. She had resumed walking. "She's moving." Rachel studied him for a second. "That isn't what I asked." The distinction irritated Ethan because he understood it immediately. Maggie being physically capable of continuing did not automatically mean continuing was the right decision. "We'll try the quieter room first," he said. Rachel nodded. The dog settled after several minutes in a smaller office away from the crowd. Tucker accepted pieces of kibble from Ethan and then attempted to climb into an empty wastebasket. Rosie explored around a desk. Maggie remained standing, but her breathing slowed. Charles Whitman arrived to speak with Ethan before the presentation. At 66, the board chairman still had the tall, narrow frame, thinning white hair, clean-shaven face, and pale, calculating eyes of a man who had spent a career making numbers behave before trusting them. He shook Ethan's hand politely. "I read the revised case file," Charles said. "And?" "It raises good questions." "That doesn't sound like an endorsement." "It isn't." Ethan almost smiled. Charles explained that several donors were interested in Rachel's proposed evaluation changes, but worried the shelter was beginning to create standards it could not afford to maintain. More assessment meant more staff time. More time meant fewer available kennels. Charles was not opposed to compassion. He was opposed to pretending compassion had no cost. "I'm told these dogs are the example," he said. "They're one example. That distinction matters. It should." Charles nodded, apparently satisfied with that answer. When the presentation began, Rachel explained the original intake. Jessica displayed photographs of Maggie and the puppies from the first week, followed by Rosie's medical findings and the revised behavioral notes. Ethan stood toward the back, with the dogs rather than beside the screen. He had refused Jessica's earlier suggestion that he speak about the rescue. There had been no single rescue, he reminded her. There had been a chain of decisions, several mistakes, and a great deal of cleaning up after Tucker. The room laughed when Jessica mentioned Tucker's habit of stealing laundry. Tucker, hearing his name, wagged his tail as though accepting an award. Maggie did not laugh. A metal chair scraped several feet away. She stiffened. Ethan felt the leash shift in his fingers. He moved toward the door. Rachel saw him and shortened the presentation. "We'll continue the discussion in the evaluation room," she told the board. Ethan nearly objected. Then he realized the evaluation room had more space and fewer chairs. What he had forgotten was the floor. The old orange tape was still there. Much of it had been removed over the months, but one bright section remained across the gray linoleum where Rosie's first assessment had taken place. Maggie entered the room, then stopped. Her front paws were perhaps 6 inches from the line. For a moment, Ethan felt as though the months between then and now collapsed. Maggie's coat was healthier. Rosie was taller. Tucker was almost too large to call little anymore. Ethan himself knew things he had not known that first morning. Yet Maggie stood exactly where she had once stood. Her mood closed, her shoulders rose. She looked toward the floor ahead. Charles approached from the side, maintaining a respectful distance. "So this was the problem area?" Rachel answered. "One of them." Charles looked at Maggie, then at the line. "Has she crossed it since?" "At home she crosses boundaries voluntarily all the time," Ethan said. "I mean here." "No." Someone behind Charles asked, "Could you show us?" The room became quiet. Ethan looked at Maggie. The leash rested in his right hand. There was plenty of slack in it. One small movement from him would remove that slack. Another would place gentle forward pressure on Maggie's collar. Nothing violent, nothing dramatic. Perhaps Maggie would cross. And everyone in the room would see what they wanted to see. Proof. The strange thing was that Ethan wanted it too. For one brief, uncomfortable second, he imagined Maggie walking across the orange line and everyone nodding. Rachel's proposal would look stronger. Jessica would have her photograph. Charles might be persuaded. Ethan himself would have visible evidence that the months of work had led somewhere. That desire frightened him more than Maggie's refusal, because it was familiar. He had once believed progress became real only when someone performed it on command. Maggie looked up at him. She did not growl. She did not retreat, but the muscles along her shoulders were tight. Ethan remembered the sleeve between her teeth, the laundry room, the night he had shouted, the first evening she had crossed the orange line at home only after he stopped asking. He loosened his fingers. The leash sagged completely. "Not today," Ethan said. The silence that followed felt heavier than any applause could have. Charles frowned slightly. "Then how do we know this is a success?" Rachel stepped beside Ethan. For a fraction of a second he saw the cost of the decision on her face. She had spent months building this proposal. Donors were watching. A photograph of Maggie calmly crossing that line might have done more fundraising work than 30 pages of careful documentation. Rachel could have asked him to try once. She did not. "Because the goal was never to make her do everything we wanted," Rachel said. "The goal was to understand which behavior actually needed changing." Charles glanced toward Maggie. Rachel continued, "Sometimes that's the dog." Then she looked toward Ethan. "And sometimes it's us." No one clapped. Ethan was grateful for that. He took Maggie, Rosie, and Tucker home before the meeting ended. That afternoon, the winter sun broke weakly through the clouds. Tucker fell asleep on the porch with his belly exposed, and all 4 legs pointed in directions that made anatomical sense only to puppies. Rosie curled beneath an old wooden chair, her nose tucked beside one front paw. Maggie lay across the open doorway. Half of her body rested inside the house, half rested on the porch. Ethan approached, carrying a mug of coffee. Maggie lifted one eye. She was directly in his way. Months earlier, Ethan might have said her name. He might have asked her to move. He might even have told himself that getting a dog to yield a doorway was simply good household management. Instead, he stopped. He looked at Maggie. Then he walked around the side of the house and entered through another door. Maggie never had to stand, and Ethan no longer needed her to. By late February, winter had loosened its grip on Lexington without quite leaving. Cold rain replaced most of the frost. Muddy patches appeared beneath the backyard fence, and on brighter afternoons the first thin blades of green pushed through the tired grass. Several months had passed since Maggie had stopped in front of the orange line at Bluegrass Animal Rescue, and Ethan Walker's house had become something it had never been during those first uneasy weeks. Ordinary. Not peaceful every minute, not perfectly organized, ordinary. Maggie still disliked metal scraping across hard floors. If Ethan dragged a chair too quickly, her head came up and her shoulders tightened before she decided whether the sound mattered. Her hips remained stiff on cold mornings, particularly on the right side, and some days she needed several slow steps before her gait loosened. Rosie had grown into a graceful young German shepherd with a narrower face than her brother and dark, thoughtful eyes that seemed to notice movement before noise. Her left side hearing loss had not disappeared. When Ethan spoke from that direction, Rosie still turned her right ear toward him, sometimes circling half a step to place the stronger side of her body toward the sound. Tucker had grown into a lanky adolescent with a broad chest, oversized feet, and enough confidence for 3 dogs. He had learned to wait behind the feeding gate, though after every meal he still inspected Maggie's and Rosie's bowls, with the solemn determination of an accountant searching for unreported income. Ethan had stopped pretending this offended him. Some habits were dangerous. Some were simply Tucker. The more important changes were quieter. Rosie could sleep in the kitchen while Maggie rested 2 rooms away. Tucker could follow Ethan into the yard without Maggie rising to check where he had gone. Maggie sometimes watched both younger dogs disappear down the hallway and simply sighed before returning her chin to her paws. Ethan had also traveled twice for short training assignments since Virginia. The first time he checked Laura Bennett's updates repeatedly. The second time he read them once in the evening and went back to work. He still made lists. He still kept backup plans for backup plans. His refrigerator held a printed feeding schedule, even though everyone involved could have recited it from memory. Ethan had not become a different man. He had simply learned to notice the point where preparation became an attempt to control uncertainty. Some days he noticed too late. That counted too. The shelter's board reached its decision in January. Rachel Morgan called him the following morning. "They didn't approve the full proposal," she said. Ethan was quiet. "How much?" "A smaller version." The board would not fund the expanded behavioral review program Rachel had originally requested. There was not enough staffing, Charles Whitman argued, and the shelter could not promise extensive individual assessment for every difficult intake. Instead, the board approved a narrower procedural change. When a nursing or recently separated mother dog showed unusually selective protective behavior toward one puppy, staff would document whether the behavior occurred around a particular surface, movement, body area, feeding context, or individual animal. If circumstances allowed, a veterinary examination or environmental test would be completed before the mother received a final dangerous behavior designation, or the family was divided specifically because of that behavior. Rachel sounded disappointed. "That's not nothing," Ethan said. "It's not what I asked for." "No." Rachel gave a short laugh. "You're supposed to tell me it's a victory." "I thought we were done making things prettier than they are." That earned him a longer silence. "Fair enough," she said. The new procedure sat in a binder for almost 3 weeks before anyone could tell whether it mattered. The test came with a German Shepherd mix named Hazel and her 6-week-old male puppy. Hazel was about 5 years old, smaller than Maggie, with a sable coat, one torn ear tip, and the weary body of a dog that had clearly raised more than one litter. She had arrived from a rural property after the owner entered assisted living. Hazel was social with staff until anyone tried to move her smallest puppy from the kennel. Then she growled, stood over him, and once snapped toward a technician's hand. The technician was Jenna Cole, 24 years old, short and athletic, with warm brown skin, thick black hair braided down her back, and large, dark eyes that made every emotion easy to read even when she wished otherwise. She had worked at Bluegrass for less than a year and still possessed the dangerous combination of compassion and urgency common among people new to shelter work. Jenna wanted to solve discomfort immediately. Rachel had spent months teaching her that frightened animals often needed fewer hands, not more. Under the old routine, Hazel's behavior might have earned an immediate protective aggression notation and a recommendation to move the puppy first. Instead, Jenna filled out the new form. The mother reacted only when that one puppy stood. Not when someone touched his back, not when someone approached his bowl, only when he tried to walk away. Rachel called Emily Parker. Emily found swelling in the puppy's left front leg. X-rays showed no fracture, only a painful soft tissue injury, consistent with having caught the leg somewhere before intake. The puppy had been hiding the pain well enough that nobody noticed until the new process forced them to ask why Hazel objected specifically to his movement. A padded support and several days of restricted activity were prescribed. As the puppy improved, Hazel stopped blocking in. Rachel read the report twice. No miracle had occurred. Hazel had not revealed a mystical diagnosis. Staff had simply slowed down long enough to observe a pattern before interpreting it. Rachel opened the bottom drawer of her office. Maggie's original file lay inside. She rested one hand on the folder for a moment, then slid Hazel's report beside it. Nothing more. Several weeks later, Ethan returned to Bluegrass Animal Rescue, carrying Maggie's updated veterinary records. Her weight had stabilized, her hips were responding well to the current plan, and Emily wanted the shelter to keep the information with the original case because Rachel had been using it for training. The building looked almost exactly as Ethan remembered it. Same blue doors, same smell of disinfectant, same uneven chorus of barking from the kennel wing. Yet places had a strange way of shrinking once a person stopped needing them to explain who he was. He found Rachel near the old evaluation room. Jenna was inside with a frightened young dog Ethan had never seen before, a thin, brindle female pressed against the far wall, with her tail curled beneath her body. Jenna stood several feet away, holding a leash. The old strip of orange tape still crossed part of the floor. Time and cleaning had faded it almost to rust. One corner had peeled upward. The brindle dog stared at Jenna's hand. Jenna shifted forward. Rachel spoke quietly from the doorway. "Give her a minute." Jenna stopped. The dog did nothing. That was the difficult part about patience. Most of the time, nothing happened while you practiced it. Ethan stood behind Rachel. Months earlier, he would have studied the dog's ears, weight distribution, exit routes, and distance to the leash. He would have wanted to identify the answer before anyone else. Now he noticed the impulse arrive, then he allowed it to pass. Rachel glanced back and saw him. "You have Maggie's paperwork?" Ethan held up the envelope. "Office," he nodded. Before following her, Ethan looked once more into the room. Jenna had lowered herself into a chair. The brindle dog remained beside the wall. No breakthrough, no crossed line, no applause. Ethan walked away. That evening, rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows. Maggie slept near the living room window, her black and tan body curled loosely on the rug. Rosie lay on a non-slip mat near the kitchen entrance, right ear angled toward the sound of Ethan rinsing a cup. Tucker occupied the armchair he technically was not supposed to use, front paws hanging over one side and his head jammed into the cushion, as if comfort required violating basic geometry. Ethan stood in the kitchen doorway. 3 dogs, 3 different places, no one watching the exit. He remembered the shelter on Maggie's first morning, the way she had placed her body between Rosie and the orange line because her puppy could not tell anyone that the floor ahead felt wrong. He remembered believing that the quickest explanation must also be the correct one. He remembered pulling the leash. He remembered being bitten. He remembered that the most important decision he eventually made was not pulling again. The orange line had begun as an instruction, do not cross. For Ethan, it had eventually become something more difficult. Ask why the line is there. A boundary was not always rejection. Sometimes it was information. Sometimes distance was the only language available to someone who could not yet explain what hurt. And sometimes love required enough humility to stop approaching long before affection gave permission to continue. Behind him, Tucker rolled in the chair and nearly fell off. Ethan caught the edge of the cushion before it tipped. Tucker opened one eye, apparently annoyed by the interference. "You're welcome," Ethan said. Rosie lifted her head. Maggie did not. She kept sleeping. The next morning, Ethan opened the back door. Cold air entered the kitchen. Tucker rushed outside first. Rosie followed at her own pace. Maggie reached the doorway and stopped. For a moment, she looked toward the wet yard. Ethan waited behind her. He did not call. He did not touch the leash hanging unused beside the door. Maggie stepped outside. Not because someone had made the decision for her, because this time, the choice was hers. Maybe the miracle in Maggie's story was never that she changed. Maybe it was that someone finally learned to stop forcing change upon her. People often mistake love for fixing. We rush to give advice, demand answers, push frightened people forward, and call it help because standing still beside someone's pain feels uncomfortable. But Maggie reminds us that trust cannot be pulled across a line. Sometimes the kindest thing we can offer is patience, space, and the freedom to choose the next step. Perhaps God works that way more often than we notice. Not always through thunderous miracles, but through quiet wisdom, softened hearts, second chances, and the moment we finally listen instead of insisting we already understand. In everyday life, there may be someone whose distance you have mistaken for rejection. Give them a little room. Love does not disappear simply because it waits. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need its message. Tell us what Maggie taught you in the comments and subscribe for more stories like this. May God bless your home, protect those you love, and give you the patience to recognize the quiet miracles already beside you.